We have already replaced one of the event handlers that we have from one I command. We created a new class inside of a new folder. In fact, we created a folder inside of the view model folder where we created this class, and we implemented the I command into this class. The I command interface added an event handler and two methods, the canExecute and the execute. The canExecute, we changed this to always return true because we're currently not going to make any evaluation, but the execute method is going to call a method from a new class that we also created. So in this same class, we have created an instance of that new class, which is HomeVM. And it is going to be obtaining its value through the constructor of the navigation command, where an object of this type is being received. In the HomeVM class, all we have is a new property that is of type navigation command, which we are initializing inside of the constructor. And it is in here where we define the method that is going to be executed from the navigation command. And I mentioned that in the view model, you want to have all of the functionality, while on the navigation command or the command itself, you only want to trigger that functionality. In this case, just calling this method. Once we have these two classes ready, back in the C# file for view, we are creating an instance of the view model, initializing it inside of the constructor, and assigning it to the binding context of the entire page in this case. And since the binding context of the entire page is already the view model, from the SAML file, we can set a binding to one of the properties of that view model as the command for the toolbar. This is the exact same thing that we're going to do in this lecture, except in this lecture, we're also going to be using command parameters. So I am going to continue replacing some of the event handlers for commands, and the next event handler that I am going to replace is the one inside of the login button inside of the main page. This is going to require something extra, because if we go to its functionality, the login button is going to be using the email entry and the password entry, or at least the text inside of those entries. So let's start by creating a new view model. So I'm going to right click on the view model folder, select create class, and this is going to be main VM for the main page. This main VM has to be public, and one of the properties that it is going to have is of type user. So I'm going to define a property of type user. To be able to use this class, we have to use a using directive. And I'm going to change the name of the property to be user. The second property that I need is a command. So let's define the command that is going to be set to that button. I am going to right click this time on the commands folder. I am going to select class, and I am going to create a login command. This login command class, of course, has to be public, and it has to implement the I command interface. We need a using directive, and we need to implement it. I am going to delete the code that is throwing an exception inside of the methods that we currently have. I am by default going to return false this time. We're going to change the functionality here in just a minute. But now let's just head back to the VM and define a property of type login command. Add the corresponding using directive that is necessary. And in the constructor for this class, I am going to initialize both properties. User then is going to be equal to a new user, and the login command is going to be equal to a new login command. Currently, both classes have a parameterless constructor, but that is about to change. Back in the login command, we need a couple of things. Just like we did before, we're going to need a property of type main VM that I am going to name viewModel. And in the constructor for this class, we have to change it so in the parameters, it receives an instance of main VM. So the viewModel property is going to be assigned to the viewModel variable that is being received as a parameter. So back in the main VM, we have to change the code. So now we pass this as the parameter for the login command constructor. And finally, inside of this main VM class, we have to define the method that is going to be called from login command. This one is going to be a public void login method. and its functionality is going to be the exact same functionality that we have currently on the event handler. So I'm actually going to cut that functionality, head back to the login method, paste it, but of course I have to make some changes. For instance, instead of passing the text inside of entries which are not available, I have to pass properties from the user. The user property has an email property, so I pass that value. And the same user property has a password property, so I pass that value. Now, because this is an async method, I have to make this method async as well. And then I am calling a method and obtaining a property that only exists inside of a page. And we're currently not in a page, but we have already solved this in the previous lecture by accessing the current instance of the app. Notice that this current property is of type application, and the current has a main page, and the main page does have a navigation. And the same thing is going to happen for the display alert, which is also coming from a page. So we already have most of the functionality for this command. This method that is going to execute the same functionality as the event handler did before is going to have to be called directly from the command. In the execute method, we're going to access through the viewModel property that we have inside of this class, the login method. Now, I said that we do have to make an evaluation in the can execute. In here, we're currently just returning false. But it turns out that this time we're going to be setting a parameter, not just the command from the SAML file. And that parameter is going to be received in the argument for the can execute and the execute methods. Currently, it is only in the can execute where we want to use this. So the first thing that I will do is get the user by parsing that parameter as user. To be able to use this user class, I need a using directive. And just like this object should now be the user. Now, we're currently not certain that this object is going to be a user, but once we set the parameter from SAML as the user, we'll know why we're making this cast. And so, having the user, we can evaluate if string.is null or empty and pass the user's email and make the same evaluation for string.is null or empty for the password, then we can return false. Else, we're going to return true. And now we are making an evaluation inside of the can execute method, this time based on the parameter that is being received. So the next thing that we have to do is navigate to the main page.saml.cs. I am going to get rid of this event handler that we have already replaced. And the first thing that I want is to create a variable of type main_vm. Add the corresponding using directive, and this is going to be viewModel. The viewModel is going to be initialized right at the beginning. And it is going to be set as the binding context for the entire page. With the binding context set, we can navigate to the SAML file, and in here first we have to set the binding to the entries, because currently the entries text is not bound to anything. So what I want to do is set the text binding to be user.email. Remember that the binding context for the stack layout is going to be the same as the binding context for the page, which is the viewModel. The viewModel is of type main_vm, which has a user object. This user property is going to have an email and a password. And it is the email the one that I am binding to the first entry. To the second entry, I am going to bind the password from the user. So user.password. And then to the button, I am going to bind the second property from the main_vm, which is the login command. So the first thing that I have to do is get rid of the clicked event handler that we currently have and set the command to be binding to the login command. But then we also need a parameter, the parameter that is going to help with the evaluation of whether or not the command can be executed. So just like there is a command property inside of a button, there is a command parameter. And the command parameter is also going to be binding, but in this case, it's going to bind to the user. the user that is still coming from the main VM class